Dylan Nicholas Redwine was born on February 6, 1999, in the United States. According to friends and relatives, he was an ordinary boy. In 2012, at the age of 13, Dylan enjoyed spending time with friends, attending school, and playing sports. His family also noted that Dylan spent a lot of time on his phone and iPad. Dylan's parents, Mark Redwine and Elaine Hall, were going through a bitter divorce. They couldn't reach an agreement, and the matter ended up in court, where issues of property division and child custody were to be decided. The court ruled that custody of Dylan would be shared between both parents. Dylan's older brother, Corey, 7 years his senior, was already an adult and chose to live with their mother. The brothers were very close, with Corey often walking Dylan to school and taking him to sports practices. Dylan, Corey, their mother, and her new partner lived in Colorado Springs. On November 18, 2012, Dylan went to visit his father to celebrate Thanksgiving. Mark lived in the suburbs of Durango, Colorado, and this visit was mandated by the court. What Dylan's family didn't know was that this would be the last time they would see him alive. Dylan had told his mother he didn't want to spend Thanksgiving at his father's house. His maternal grandmother had been diagnosed with cancer, and Dylan wanted to spend time with her. However, due to the court's decision, the visit couldn't be postponed, and Dylan was compelled to go to his father's home. On November 18, Dylan texted friends and relatives, as usual, and even called a few classmates. Everything seemed normal. At 9:37 p.m., Dylan sent his last message to his mother, wishing her a good night and saying they would talk the next day. But the next morning, Elaine didn't receive any messages from her son. Instead, she received a call from Mark, her ex-husband. He asked if she knew where Dylan was because he hadn't seen him for several hours. Elaine became worried and told Mark she had no idea about Dylan's whereabouts. Mark's house was a 6-hour drive from Elaine's, making it impossible for Dylan to have gone to her on his own. A search for Dylan began in the surrounding areas. That same day, November 19, at 6:00 p.m., Mark reported Dylan as missing. Mark told the police that on the morning of November 19, he went shopping while Dylan stayed home watching TV. When Mark returned around 11:30 a.m., Dylan was gone. Mark said he searched the area and asked neighbors, but no one knew where the teenager was. After speaking with Elaine and learning she had no information, Mark decided to file a missing person report. The police noted that not only was Dylan missing, but his belongings were as well. The search began immediately, involving investigators, volunteers, search dogs, and helicopters. Since Dylan was a minor, urgency was paramount. Later, some of Dylan's belongings were found. A shoe was discovered first. To confirm it belonged to Dylan, a DNA test was conducted. Elaine had kept one of Dylan's baby teeth for years, which made the DNA comparison possible. The test confirmed the shoe belonged to Dylan. A second shoe was found later. However, for 7 months, no further clues or Dylan's body were found. In June 2013, investigators discovered human remains that were identified as Dylan's. However, it was impossible to determine what had happened to him because some parts of the body, including the skull, were missing. The investigation slowed as police began focusing on other cases due to the lack of leads in Dylan's. A reward was offered for any information about the teenager, but no significant breakthroughs occurred. In November 2015, 2 years after Dylan's remains were found, a couple on an excursion stumbled upon a skull. Initially, they thought it belonged to an animal since there were many other bones nearby. However, they became suspicious and called the police. While most of the bones were confirmed to be animal remains, the skull was human. DNA testing revealed it belonged to Dylan. Unfortunately, even with this discovery, it remained unclear what had happened to the boy. Dylan's mother and brother closely followed the investigation, refusing to give up hope. Despite the years that had passed, they remained determined to find answers about what had happened to Dylan and to seek justice. It's worth noting that Dylan's electronic devices and backpack were never found. 5 years passed since Dylan was last seen alive. His mother and brother continued to pressure the police to take action. In 2017, the case file and all evidence were handed over to a different investigator. The police believed that a fresh perspective on the case might uncover new leads. According to the report, traces of Dylan's DNA had been found in Mark's, Dylan's father's, house. This detail had not been disclosed earlier. Bloodstains were discovered in the living room, on the couches, the floor, the coffee table, and beneath the rug. Additionally, cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains pointed to specific areas in the house, such as the living room near the washing machine, the back of Mark's truck, and on Mark's clothing. The new investigators couldn't understand why this evidence had been ignored in the past. Based on the findings, they were confident they could charge the father. It was revealed that the initial team working on the case had previously tried to obtain an arrest warrant. However, the judge deemed the evidence insufficient to detain the man. The new team succeeded in compelling Mark Redwine to appear for questioning. During interrogation, Mark claimed he was willing to cooperate with the police but maintained that he had nothing to do with his son's death. He even presented his version of events. He suggested that Dylan might have wanted to visit his grandmother or simply did not want to stay with his father. According to Mark, Dylan took his belongings and left while Mark was out shopping. He theorized that the teenager wandered into the forest, where he could have been attacked by a wild animal. A forensic medical examination provided no substantial new information. As a result, the decision was made to enlist a skilled forensic anthropology expert to reanalyze the bones, particularly Dylan's skull. The expert identified marks on the skull that could not have been caused by a wild animal. She concluded that Dylan had been struck on the head with a sharp object, such as a knife. However, she noted another mark on the skull that might have been caused by an animal, though she believed this occurred post-mortem. She determined that Dylan had received multiple blows to the head, which likely caused his death. At this new stage of the investigation, Dylan's brother, Corey, testified again. He recounted an incident from 2011 when he, Dylan, and their father were on a road trip. While exploring Mark's computer, the brothers discovered disturbing photographs. Corey later saved the images on his phone and handed them over to the police. These photos showed Mark dressed in women's lingerie and makeup, eating feces from a diaper. While Corey wasn't particularly affected by the images, Dylan was deeply disturbed and lost all respect for his father. Dylan frequently confided in Corey about his shame and embarrassment regarding what he had seen. According to Corey's testimony, in June 2013, before Dylan's skull was found, Mark had casually mentioned in a conversation that he believed Dylan had died from a blow with a blunt object. With all this new information, the judge issued an arrest warrant for Mark. 5 years after Dylan's disappearance was reported, investigators concluded that Dylan had been killed in the living room of his father's house. Mark had then transported his son's body and scattered the remains in different locations. According to investigators, the murder occurred following an argument between Dylan and Mark over the photos Dylan had discovered. Since the remains were found in separate locations, it was determined that Mark had dismembered his son's body. On Saturday, July 22, 2017, 55-year-old Mark Redwine was arrested in Washington, where he was working as a long-haul truck driver. He was fined $1 million and extradited to Colorado. There, he was detained while awaiting trial for over 3 years. Initially, the trial was scheduled for November 2018 but was postponed because the judge was handling other cases. In September 2019, it was delayed again after Mark's attorney was arrested for domestic violence. Then, in April 2020, the trial was postponed once more, this time due to the global pandemic. Finally, the trial began in June 2021. On June 21st, the judge overseeing the case was announced, and proceedings officially started on June 24th. During the trial, the prosecution argued that Mark's relationship with Dylan had been strained due to the photographs the teenager had discovered. On the morning of Dylan's death, they claimed, the two had an argument that escalated, leading Mark to kill his son. The defense countered that Dylan might have run away and been attacked by a wild animal. They highlighted that the distance between Dylan's skull and the initial discovery of his bones was 2 kilometers. According to the defense, if Mark had intended to hide the remains in separate locations, he would have scattered them further apart. They suggested that an animal might have moved part of the body to where it was first found. The prosecution called Dylan's friends as witnesses, including 22-year-old Ryan Abba, who was only 11 years old when the events occurred. Ryan had been one of Dylan's closest friends. On the day Dylan was reported missing, he was supposed to meet Ryan at his house, but he never showed up. Other friends also confirmed that they lost contact with Dylan that morning. The prosecution argued that if Dylan had run away, he would have reached out to his friends. Elaine, Dylan's mother, also testified in court. She recalled losing contact with her son that morning, which she found unusual. However, she assumed he was spending quality time with his father and decided not to interfere. Her concern grew when she received an email from Mark asking if she had seen Dylan. Elaine replied that she had not and expressed her worry. The physical distance between her home and Mark's made it impossible for Dylan to attempt walking home. When she asked Mark where their son was, he told her the same story he had given the police, that he had gone shopping and returned to find Dylan gone. Elaine's suspicions grew when Mark claimed he had reported Dylan missing hours before he actually did. When she called the sheriff's office near Mark's home, they confirmed they had not received any such report at the time. For Elaine and others close to Dylan, Mark was always the primary suspect. The prosecution emphasized that the last known contact Dylan had was on the night of November 18th. Blood traces were found in multiple locations inside Mark's home. Cadaver dogs signaled these same locations and also indicated Mark's vehicle and clothing. Notably, the dogs detected the scent of Dylan on clothes Mark claimed the boy had worn the night before his disappearance. The prosecution also pointed out that Mark's truck had high ground clearance and that he was very familiar with the remote roads in the area. Mark's defense repeated its earlier claim that Dylan had run away after an argument about the photos and had been attacked by a wild animal in the mountainous terrain. While Mark chose not to testify, his attorney argued that the physical evidence, such as the distance between the skull and the first discovered remains, supported the possibility of animal activity. The defense further stated that Mark had not harmed Dylan, insisting that the boy's death was a tragic accident unrelated to his father. Countering these arguments, the prosecution noted that Dylan's personal belongings, such as his wallet and backpack, were never recovered. They argued it was improbable that an animal would have taken those items. Moreover, an anthropologist testified that the sharp force injuries found on Dylan's skull could not have been caused by an animal. The expert maintained that the marks were consistent with being inflicted by a sharp object, likely a weapon. On July 16, 2021, after nearly a decade of uncertainty, Mark Redwine, then 59, was found guilty of second-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death. Initially, he was sentenced to 48 years in prison for the murder. A sentencing hearing was held on October 8, 2021, where the judge reaffirmed the sentence, citing numerous aggravating factors. The court noted Mark's lack of remorse and his refusal to cooperate in providing critical information about Dylan's disappearance. For Dylan's mother and brother, the verdict brought a long-awaited sense of justice. It was a heartbreaking case where a father's anger spiraled into a heinous act of violence. Dylan's relationship with his father had deteriorated after discovering the incriminating photos. The argument over the images ultimately led to a fatal confrontation. Mark, who had a history of violent behavior, let his rage overcome him, resulting in Dylan's tragic death and the disposal of his remains in various locations.